Good afternoon, everyone. How's everybody doing this afternoon? Good. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm Anik, Bose, the moderator. I'm also managing partner of BGV. It's an early-stage venture fund with an office here in Paris and also in Silicon Valley.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sean Perryman. I am the head of AI Policy and Fairness at Uber, based out of Washington, D.C.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Professor Leon Derczynski, and I work with safety and security at NVIDIA.
Hi, everyone. I'm Natasha Crampton. I'm Microsoft's Chief Responsible AI Officer.
Hi, my name is Joanna Bryson. I'm Professor of Ethics and Technology at the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin.
Hi, I'm Nathalie. I'm the CEO of Naaia. It's a platform risk and compliance management.
Great. The topic of this panel discussion is building trustworthy AI. And we're going to try and focus on the interplay of innovation, responsibility, and democratization. Why is this an important topic? Because without trustworthy AI, we will not have adoption of AI. And without adoption of AI, we will not have the benefits that everybody's promising that AI can bring for the world. So, what I'd like to do is maybe just set some context for you as part of this conversation. So if you look at the pace of technology development, whether it's been GPUs or whether it's been LLMs, it's been dizzying. I think the number of floating point operations per dollar has doubled literally every 2.5 years. What's been also interesting is we've seen and we've heard at various sessions here that you have the larger models, language models, larger data centers, more energy. Bigger is better. But what's been interesting is while technology has moved rapidly, there's been a lag in what I would call the human-centric and data-centric guardrails. These are things like privacy, bias, data quality, compliance, security, and so on and so forth. And what's been also interesting and timely is until the launch of DeepSeek, the belief that bigger is better and that resource-intensive AI models shape the innovation landscape, that narrative has started changing, where it was a shot across the bow where everybody would think, well, unless you're a well-capitalized big tech company out of the US, you have little shot at trying to basically win in this space. So what we're going to basically do today is start with a couple of questions around AI's current trajectory. So maybe I'll start with you, Leon, talking a little bit about what do you see as some of the risks of AI value creation when you think about potentially the landscape being dominated by a few big tech players?
I mean, so AI's got to work for everyone, right? And I think it's really important for people to have access to the resources that they need in order to develop and deploy AI. I think there was a big risk kind of moment, it seemed in early 2023, where it wasn't certain if we would be looking at a few major players concentrating advances or this being more broad. And how that played out was answered really quickly, actually, right? I think when you look at Spring 23 and the flourishing of models and the science being conducted really openly, as it had been beforehand, and we saw kind of massive differentiation and realized that actually it's a little bit easier to enter the game, right? And we keep seeing this with scientific advances being made openly and a lot of open source development, or even, we were talking earlier, right, about how there often is parallel discovery, and this, privately, but this only ever affords a temporary advantage. And these kind of ways of accessing advances tend to become open. So, yeah, I think there's a low risk, but I think one has to make sure that people have access to the resources that they need in order to leverage those advances, both resources in terms of humans with the right skills, and in terms of data and algorithms, and also in terms of places to go and do that research and run that AI.
Natasha?
So I think when we think about the sort of significant advances that we've seen in the ecosystem, even in recent weeks and months, I think it's really key that we understand that there are really sort of three key essential elements that we need to remain focused on as we continue to scale up. The first is that we must maintain a strong foundation of trust. Trust is not given, it is earned, and we need to do that every step of the way. And it is the case that this is both about upholding timeless values like commitments to privacy and security, reliability and safety, fairness and inclusiveness. But it's also about making sure that we are working in line with user expectations. And I think as a group of startups and founders yourself, you know that user expectations are changing as well. The second piece of it that I think is really important is that we have to keep advancing not just the capabilities of the technology, but also the safety practices need to keep pace. And there's actually a huge number of sort of unanswered questions that are still really research questions as to more sort of advanced modes of safety, which we need to continue to focus on. And then third, I just point to one of Leon's comments here about the need for skilling. When we think about AI technology at Microsoft, we really think about AI as being the next great general purpose technology, much like electricity. And so if we look back at history and learn what it took in order to be able to safely but broadly adopt a technology like electricity, it turns out that skilling in all of its forms was actually very important to that. And so that is both skilling in the nature of, continuing to build our population of builders and founders, but it's also broad-based skilling for the whole population as well.
Makes sense. Maybe a question for you, Sean. When you think about it, are there any factors that are being overlooked in the race to scale AI solutions?
Are there any factors
that are being overlooked?
Yeah, and I think this goes. I think this goes back to your original question, right? Like the risk here is that there's uneven development. We've seen that with all sorts of technology, whether it's the way that surveillance is used in certain communities and not others, the way that biometrics is deployed for people who can afford the technology. We want this to be something that provides benefits to all and is not used unevenly, or the gains are not distributed unevenly. So when I look at what has been sort of overlooked, two things I would call out. One, I don't know if I agree with your initial point that without trust, people won't adopt the technology. People will adopt the technology. It's just that we won't be able to ensure that everyone is getting it safely, that certain people won't be exploited by it. So I think, I believe that it's our responsibility, both in the private sector and the public sector, to have that framework for how do we make sure that people are using this and deploying it in a responsible way. Because it will be deployed regardless. As long as there's profit to be made, people will deploy technology. It's how do we insert some sort of accountability and responsibility. So I think that hasn't gone overlooked, but it's definitely something that we are all struggling to figure out the best way to achieve while balancing innovation, as we do on this, as we talk about on this panel. And then the second point that I would make as far as things that have been overlooked is just the rapid development that's been happening with a handful of players in one country, one or two countries, compared to everyone else. And so I've heard time and time again this weekend and today, just how everyone wants to be a part of this. If this is I think all of us can agree, this technology is going to change the world, period. It's not different in a sense of paradigm for technology we've been seeing before, but the scale, the advancements we've seen, is going to change the world. And what we're discussing here at this conference is it going to be a positive or negative change, and how we can shape that in some way. So those were what I would say.
Joanna?
Yeah, first of all, when we talk about, I broadly agree with what's said before, but I want to reframe it a little bit, right? If we look at things, if we don't just look at the largest possible companies, if we look at things like who's defending AI patents in the WIPO database, then you actually find that, that Europe is actually on par with China in terms of the amount of IP that's being produced and the market capitalizations of the companies holding that IP. And actually, you also see the rest of the world, excluding the US, has aggregate more than China and the EU combined. So the digital is a great leveler. And I think some of these questions about scaling, first of all, I do think exactly as was said on the previous panel, it was a lot of hype, it was a lot of attempt at geopolitics, exaggerations of the importance of scale. But in fact, I used to be standing on stages in the EU saying, you don't need, it's basic statistics, you don't need redundant data, you know, if someone says they need all the data in the world, all they care about is surveillance, right? Now, so it didn't turn out to be entirely, there did turn out to be some other things we could do. But anyway, I want to get back to the point. The point is that when there are things that really need scale, then we tend to call those things utilities. So in antitrust theory, you say, okay, there are some things that really have to operate at large scale, and they're not going to have a huge number of providers. And so those things need extra regulation, and they still need to have multiple providers so that we have resilience. So GPS is a great example. In theory, we only need one set of satellites, but because of geopolitics, because the world is not perfect, even technologically we make mistakes, even if all the countries are reliable, we have like 4 or 5 sets of GPS, and still some people are finding ways to block that, right? So I think that to the extent we will have to have this kind of compute, we need a model where we go back to actually enforcing the antitrust regulations that ironically the United States innovated, and taking away the things that can be businesses that can actually be managed by competition more than by governance. Mm-hmm. And having those spun out and actually running in ordinary markets and not being parts of things that are actually critical infrastructure. And the critical infrastructure then becomes more boring, the kinds of things that retired people invest in, you know, so you know, with reliable returns. And that's what happens. Once you've become something that everybody depends on, you don't get to be radical anymore. And the radical, exciting innovation and stuff, that's stuff that's out in the market, and that should be regulated separately, in fact, by competition.
Very well said. Maybe turning to you, Nathalie, a question for you is trusted. We talked about trust in AI. How can guardrails help create more trusted and reliable AI solutions?
Okay, as Natasha said already, trustworthy is like a to be or not to be question for AI, actually. It's not an option, it's a sole condition of the sustainable innovation and adoption. So how we in a global point of view, not in EU point of view, but because I will not talk about the AI Act now, but in a global point of view, how we do need framework, and perhaps we can say that the 4 golden rules of framework will be a risk-based approach with a real case use-centric, first of all. To commit all the stakeholders to respect the framework, the one who develops, the one who sold, the ones who use. Also a life cycle approach for embedding security and quality. And on the top, when we have authority, the authority have to be a sort of innovation companion and to be very close to the civil society and to the tech innovation, to understand the need, for sure to be strict because it's the role of the authority, but not to cut the link between innovation and regulation, because as we know all here, the debate, the historic debate is regulation against innovation, but here it's not possible because the trustworthy have to be framed, and if the red line is crossed by some player, we have to find solution to prevent and to protect the value, the golden value.
Can you add something to that, Sean?
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, I agree with much of that what was said. And when I think about that framework, I think of AI governance, right? That's governance that we're talking about in so many ways. Recently at Uber, we've gone through this exercise, right? Because it's not enough to say, well, trust us. You know, you need to have that framework in place, whether that's leaders at the top doing this, day-to-day people. And what we'll find, especially as we scale AI governance, is that it's going to take both the people and machines working together in some way to do it correctly. But we recently went through a assessment with Kathy O'Neill from Orca. And what we did, the way we approached it is first defining risk. You have to define what is risk, how risky things are, categories of risk, and then how do you have accountability and insert accountability into the way that you're deploying those AI systems. But to your point, again, it cannot be a trust us model. You have to also have your stakeholders at the table as well. Here in France is actually a good example. We've used the social dialogue system with unions before to sit down and say, you know, algorithms are deciding deactivations at times, right? How do we have a human in the loop to make sure that those decisions are right? Because that is affecting someone's day-to-day life. So it's really context specific, but if you have the governance in place, you can deploy these things in a way that makes sense for the way you're deploying the systems.
Got it. Joanna, you want to talk about the role of governments in this?
Well, I wanted to come back in on the innovation supposed trade-off of regulation. I just want to amplify what was said earlier this morning by a gentleman from Proton. I've forgotten his name. But he was anyway amplifying Lena Khan, I can remember her name, in pointing out that all these companies that are now the current giants, they are there because of the antitrust regulation was still being applied in the mid-20th century. So for example, AT&T was sort of a national champion, but people were worried about how much power it had. So all of its IP was just liberated. And so that's why the United States is so dominant in transistors, right? I mean, I know obviously there's a lot happening in other countries too, but there's still a very key part of that value chain. And so, you know, basically there wouldn't have been a room, an opening for Google and Microsoft, as large of I mean, you came in early, but as large of a hole as there was, if it hadn't been for the fact that AT&T and IBM had long antitrust settlements. So actually, history has shown over and over, and my colleague James Besson from Boston University has written a beautiful book called The New Goliaths, showing that in every sector, not just AI, that the use of software is allowing people to solve the problems of logistics. You get this enormous growth of whoever invests the most and basically becomes a natural monopoly, and then you see a slowing down of innovation in that sector. And this is China. China is actually doing a good job of addressing this problem right now.
Great, great. Let's turn to the topic I think some of you brought up about democratizing AI innovation. And when you think about, you know, the best way, as you said, you know, to kind of drive democratization is to have more startups that are innovating at the application layer on top of the infrastructure that's being built by big tech. What steps are needed to ensure startups have access to cutting-edge AI tools and data that are not prohibitively expensive? Maybe Natasha, you can share your perspective on that. I know Microsoft is doing a lot of things in that area.
Sure. So I think, you know, the way that we should think about this whole unit is that it's an ecosystem, and an ecosystem needs to be diverse to be a healthy ecosystem. And in fact, the diversity of ecosystems is typically their strength. And we see this in nature, but this is also true in the tech world as well. So, you know, of course, a company like Microsoft really provides, you know, broad infrastructure as well as, you know, many different types of finished products. But fundamentally, we've been a platform company from the very beginning, which means it's it's not about just our own success. We can't be successful unless our customers and their end users are ultimately successful. You know, you might have heard our CEO, Satya Nadella, famously say, you know, if you want to be cool, you can go and work at various other places, but if you want to make other people cool, you should come and work at Microsoft. And this is, in fact, how it's been in my own experience. So let me just give you one example of how I see, you know, a really healthy ecosystem coming together that combines big tech and little tech and VCs and academia. And it's just a really recent example that some of you might have come across this week. It was just announced a couple of days ago. So there's a new initiative called Roost, which is all about robust, open online safety tools. What's so great about this initiative, where they're essentially bringing together a whole collaborative of different players to contribute, is that everybody's had a contribution there, and the benefits are broad and wide. So there are big tech players in this collaboration, and what are they doing? They're doing things like, you know, contributing the in-house safety tools that we have built ourselves to help, you know, manage takedown requests or process different types of security incidents in a way that can be managed at scale. So they're contributing tooling. From Microsoft, we have both, you know, Azure credits as well as we've got GitHub contributing a survey of all of the tools that have come together. There are academic partners. VCs are in there incentivizing their startups to benefit from this. So I think I use that example to say there's ways in which we've got to be able to contribute from our unique points of strength, but also to lift up the whole as well, because fundamentally, as I said at the beginning, I think a diverse ecosystem is a healthy ecosystem, and there are places for everybody in this.
Great. Sean, maybe a question for you. What do you see as the role of open source in the AI supply chain?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that could be an answer to both your questions, right? Open source is one way that we can support the ecosystem and innovation. But I view open source, when we look at traditional software, it's something estimated somewhere between 70 to 90% of that software is open source, is innovated through open source. So I view this as an access point. I view that as key to democratization. And I know that we are having this conversation about AI, and in the background of that, it's always the debate between, especially the most sophisticated models, whether they should be open or closed source. But I think if we're thinking about the ecosystem and we're thinking about how to democratize the gains, we have to be talking about open source. We have to be talking about providing access. When I look at Uber and how we contribute to the various different ecosystems we're in the UK, we have investments and partnerships with companies like Wave, who are doing autonomous vehicles. We recently had a partnership with NVIDIA, right? When you look at autonomous vehicles and the way that our data, we're on roads across the world, how can that help with starting up a new ecosystem like with AVs? So these are some of the ways that you can contribute, but it's got to be geared towards innovation and sharing and with that sort of mindset.
Other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think to echo a lot of the points there, from where we're standing, I think open source is this undeniably critical part of access to AI, right? We're building on open science. You know, lots of these advances that we all rely on are either already published, maybe even peer-reviewed if we're lucky, or published shortly after they're used. So this is kind of, for me, this is the first layer of open source, right? And then we have open source software, and there are these wonderful stacks people are building. European companies like Hugging Face built their entire system in open source to do open source things, and it's been a wonderful accelerator, right? It's been fantastic for innovation. We really appreciate it. It's great stuff. And all the code used to do this is also open source. I mean, the projects we have, where we're looking at especially safety and security, again, these are things that we develop open source, because it's the best way, I think, to ensure, like, accelerated innovation and also to increase trust in AI, make it easier to find out where the weaknesses are, where the crinkles are, and go and iron them out. The traditional cybersecurity learned this lesson kind of a while ago. If you keep things really closed, you end up building a weaker and less trustworthy ecosystem. And I think that's something we should, and I hope have taken to heart with AI.
Yeah, so maybe a follow-up question to that. What was interesting for me is when DeepSeek came out, what is defined as open source, right? That's a very important question. And they were the first guys to say, here are the weights, here are the training loops, and even Llama, and they don't publish any of that stuff. So if anybody wants to build on it, it's really not open. I mean, it's a pricing model as opposed to kind of what does open source mean. So I'd love to have your perspectives on that.
I am the same age and kind of background as Meredith Whittaker. So for those of you who were here before, she just said, like, we don't think something is open source. My idea of open source is I can download it, I can run it on my own machine, I can see how everything works, and I can then know that for a fact. So I often do this as a scientist, right, to verify whether or not a simulation actually worked the way people presented it or something like that. So it's a little weird when a lot of people are calling things open source that are actually sort of APIs. And then that's not really open, because then if that company shuts down the back-end server, then you're stuck. And this comes back to the point before about having essential infrastructure has to have extra oversight so that we can guarantee that doesn't happen except in exceptional situations. And I do hope that Europe will think hard about that. But I wanted to actually go a slightly different direction, which was that she said then, therefore, because of the nature of what Signal does, where she's working, and the value of data and the fact that they refuse that, they have to be a nonprofit. But then they're in this weird situation that everybody knows they have the best product and they're using them for like the military. And then somebody else comes up with some fly-by-night thing they call AI, and then they make billions of dollars off of this product that's less reliable, right? And so I think one of the really interesting challenges of our era, and this is true for the future of work in general, is what is a reasonable way to handle redistribution? What is reasonable wages? How do we actually get obviously Uber has this problem in spades. What is the right amount of money to pay the drivers and all that kind of thing? And I actually think this is one of the places Europe has a real edge, because there is really strong social reasoning, strong civil society, and it's going to require, again, a lot of innovation. Governance is innovation too. I can sell something, come to Hertie School and help us invent the future, but the future through governance, right? A lot of these challenges, but I think we are in a good place to integrate all these kinds of challenges and to try to make sure that our societies are sustainable and secure and happy, flourishing.
Thank you. Building a responsible, inclusive AI future, I think, Natasha, you talked about a healthy, thriving ecosystem has to be diverse, right? So this is a question for all of you, and please feel free to kind of jump in. What are some of the first actionable steps to create a more balanced and trustworthy AI ecosystem?
I'll jump in to begin with. Look, I think if you're a founder or you've got an established business, I would say that, not only is it important to sort of build in responsible practices by design, but there's actually a huge number of resources available publicly, freely today to help you do that. Whether it's, some of the open source safety tooling that exists already, there's evaluation suites that are available through organizations like ML Commons. There are practices that you can borrow from many organizations. Of course, I'm familiar with Microsoft, but there are very many other guides and frameworks that you can borrow to, do an impact assessment, really think about what good documentation looks like. So I would say leverage all of those resources that are available out there already. And then in return, I would say contribute what you learn. I think we're all better together when it comes to trustworthy practices, and thinking about how you can take what you learn in your businesses, in your organizations, and find ways to, return the favor to the open source ecosystem, find a way to publish your lessons, find a way to share your experiences with your peers and others that are on this journey with you. I do think it is really a collective effort, and it's one of these efforts where a rising tide lifts all boats.
Other thoughts on that?
I actually have a question to ask back to you. Do you see the AI Act, since it has a lot of opportunities for transparency, as an opportunity to establish trust, to show, hey, we're a European AI Act compliant or Digital Services Act compliant organization? Do any of you guys look at that as an opportunity?
Yes, I mean, for my part, I think of transparency as one of the most foundational principles in this space, and in many ways, transparency is enabling of other ends that you want to meet. So, for example, if you want to do well at upholding privacy commitments, then you should be clear and straightforward about how you use people's data. If you want to do well in building a system that serves many different people well on the fairness front, then you should also be transparent about the types of testing that you have done. So I do think, transparency is a matter of good business practice and as a matter of law these days in the European Union. So we do need to do more work, to be clear, on developing standardized formats so that there can be shared expectations across the ecosystem of what good practice looks like. I think for Microsoft, we're both focused on making sure that when we make available, our services that founders and startups and other businesses are building on top of, we want everyone to have a clear understanding of what the capabilities and the limitations of our technology building blocks are. But there's a different type of transparency that's needed when you're using, for example, a finished application. And so I think the EU Act implementation, as well as many other laws around the world, will provide an opportunity to actually specify what those practices look like in more detail.
Yeah, I think to your question of how we go about doing this, repetition doesn't spoil the prayer. I'll say it again. I think you have to first define what is risk, and you have to really think about the context that you're operating in, and then from there, you also have to think about who you're deploying to, who's your audience here, right? Because when we talk about transparency and explainability, if you are deploying to an engineer who's going to use it, it's very different than us deploying to a driver and how we explain things and how we make that tangible to them. So I think that all is part of your considerations. But to your point, the EU AI Act was absolutely critical to how we think about defining risk. I would also say the NIST risk management framework in the US, we use that very much when we think about model impact assessments and how we go about answering those questions. Because while us in the room may be thinking about governance and AI in every day, even the folks using the technology, they're not necessarily thinking about it in the same terms. So it does give you a framework for how to translate within a company, translate to different audiences, and how to conceptualize both risk and accountability.
Nathalie, go ahead.
Yes, I think it's important also to tell that it's not only AI Act in the world, AI regulation, because many countries actually have a regulation in progress, perhaps 60. Some are already out, like in South Korea or in China, for big law around AI and other countries. So we are not alone in Europe to build a regulation framework. Saying that, aside from regulation, a company may have difficulty to understand how to convert obligation into action. And that's why we talk many about which framework, how we can operate the obligation. So for sure, technical standards, as for example here, and I mentioned it, ISO 42001, is actually a standard who may help all size of companies, the small, the middle, and the big, to play in the same league, because it's quality and security standard and a management system. So sure, the main tool to obtain the same or quite the similar, and to interoperate products that no one is domestic, all product actually is global. For sure, standards will be the right tools.
Great. So maybe one last question, which is, what does a truly democratized AI future look like? We have heard it doesn't mean it's one country and 3 companies. It has to benefit all, has to be a diverse ecosystem. So I'd love for each of you to kind of share, what's your vision? What does that look like? Anyone wants to get first?
I'm happy to talk about this. I actually have a problem because people have used the word democratization to mean decentralized. Mm-hmm. Now, when you can be decentralized, that's really useful. It's great when like a household has its own electricity, and especially if they're being attacked by Russia or something, it's nice to have the solar panels on the roof there. But actually, democracy to me is a representative thing. It's and literally, I have been in the rooms with people saying, if only we could know, if we had some way of finding out, like representing the people in the room, so we could have this argument between industry and government. It's like, well, first of all, government is trying to support industry. We want to have a flourishing economy that actually, that's actually what we do. We actually make regulations that make it likely that we're going to have more industry. But secondly, that way that we represent the people, it's called democracy, and that's what the government is. Why are you portraying them as like some weird alien force that landed in a spaceship, right? So, I mean, I could see that for some governments right now, but, in general, what we need to be working on is trying to keep our governments representing the interests of their people, including the minorities.
Other thoughts on that? Okay.
What will be great is AI for everyone everywhere, but it's utopic things actually. So perhaps the right way is literacy, to how to use, how to understand, how to measure, how to evaluate, and in fact, it's the first big step of democratization. It's literacy at every stage of the value chain, in fact. So again, the one who develops, the one who commercializes, the one who explains, the one who trains, the one who uses, the children also at every stage.
Yeah, one of the topics that's interesting is when I look at AI and the ubiquitous nature of it and the self-scaling nature of it, it reminds me of a much smaller technology which has become pervasive now, which is cybersecurity. And if you think about in the early 2000s, there was no chief information security officer. Cybersecurity was not a board-level issue, and people were kind of flying by the seat of the pants, right? So when you think about AI, what lessons are learned from that journey for this massive technology that needs to be dealt with at a board level, at a senior management level? So there's a massive education challenge here as well. So thoughts on that?
So I believe that as companies developing some of the core building blocks and introducing them into the world, we have a first and deep responsibility to make sure that what we're putting into the world is actually developed in a way that is private and secure and reliable and safe and fair, inclusive. All of these timeless principles, it is actually our responsibility to do that first and foremost. But it's also not going to be enough that we just have, core responsibility by the organizations building this technology. We are going to need laws as well. Laws play a very important role in setting, a common standard across the board. And so I think there's much that can be done by industry leaders here, and while not everything is perfect, I do sense, in contrast to prior technology waves, a very strong commitment by some of the leading AI labs and associated parties to really try and do the right thing. I mean, it was striking to me, for example, that at some of these various summits leading up to the AI Action Summit, there have been many voluntary commitments made and now real action under those commitments. And there are frameworks, there are practices. I know this from working alongside our industry peers. So I would say it is incumbent on players to really do the most that they can do, and also governments need to act. These two things cannot be separated. Both things are necessary.
Joanna?
I really want to, I thank you for what you're saying, but we do have to remember that there are some companies that are really pushing back. So if you think about let's see, I'm trying to remember the name, it doesn't matter. Oh, Institute for Strategic Dialogue. They have an annual sort of Chatham Rule meeting about how are the recommender algorithm kind of, as you mentioned, there's many countries now, as well as the EU, regulating sort of what here in the EU we call the Digital Services Act, but making sure that we're not being manipulated. And it was going all nice with all these friendly voluntary agreements until the legislation came in place. And then some companies really started just attacking and shutting things down. Obviously, Meta shutting down their crowd triangle. Obviously, Twitter being purchased, and then all the ethics people being dismissed. I mean, this is public knowledge. It's not slanderous, right? So these are, and I was told at one of these Chatham Rule meetings that tobacco industry did exactly the same thing. They pretended to play along, but once there was actual legislation in place, they turned vicious and the knives came out. And so I think there are differences between companies. They have different cultures. They have different priorities. But we really, really have to watch out for some of these things. And of course, we really, really have to be looking at what is happening in the United States right now. I just feel like we cannot say, oh, democracy is a great thing when we're seeing a whole, that the White House has actually deleted the Constitution and the previous presidents off of their website. I mean, let alone the fact that they're releasing all kinds of data in blatantly illegal ways by their own legal system. So it isn't that democracy is a perfect answer either. These are all things we have to keep working on.
Leon, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think, Natasha, you made some really good points about transparency. And I think if we're going to reach useful democratization, and maybe even have useful, kind of improved regulation, I think it'd be really good if we could see a little bit more in terms of being transparent about where the crinkles are with our models, right? Like we know they're not perfect. And I think if we're going to increase trust in these models, it's okay if we're a little bit braver, maybe those producing models, in describing where those crinkles are. And I think one loses, like a lot of trust is eroded if it's the end user who gets a bad experience and it feeds up through this route. And just being able to do, I mean, we see some great progress here with things like ML Commons, right? Mm-hmm. Although it's not always like, some of the models can be anonymous with this kind of thing, that's fine. It's a strong step in absolutely the right direction. And if we can start being a little more open about, and confident, I guess, with what the model doesn't do, what it's not intended for, that transparency really both helps democratization and eases adoption. It kind of completes the loop for me.
Great. So maybe, in closing, I'd like to share something that I was kind of motivated by what you just said, Natasha, which is basically everyone should share what they've learned as they go along. So, at BGV, one of the things we're doing is we're kind of releasing an industry-first AI native playbook for startups so that AI founders don't have to make everything up on the fly, because there's a lot of net new things that are happening here. And we look forward to working with like-minded VCs and enterprises to kind of move that forward. So if any of you have questions, come and look for me or my partner, Sarah, or anyone else here. Any last statements here from the group? Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.